And we're joined now by James Reeler, Climate Action Senior Manager at South Africa Worldwide Fund for Nature. A very good evening to you, and thank you so much for speaking to us. We saw President Ramaphosa speak about that climate change response fund, saying it'll bring together all spheres of government and private sector in a collaborative effort to build resilience and our response to impacts of climate change. But I'm just wondering, from where you're sitting, upon hearing that announcement, or we've heard something akin to that over the past couple of years, what approach that is new is best?
Thanks, Lisa. Evening. I think it's an interesting one. It's can be tempting to read a lot into it, but we really only have 2 sentences to work off here, so it's very early days. The point of the matter is, of course, that we have had significant impacts from kind of climate-driven or climate change enhanced, if you like, weather events over the last few years, and we can expect to see that going forward. And obviously, that does then necessarily mean that there are these impacts that somehow we have to deal with. And so, I think we should welcome the principle of the fund. The question is really just, how does it land? Who is going to provide the funding? How does one access it? Who is it targeted at? At the moment, it sounds very much like it's going to be a disaster sort of response fund, more than a resilience planning one. So it's not necessarily doing the proactive work up front, which is sort of a critical element. But it's hard to say at this moment.
Well, it's interesting because, as you say, it's more proactive rather than resilience. But I'm thinking somewhere along that thinking, when we talk about early warning systems, which forms part of the wider matrix of how we're going to deal with that. Looking at KwaZulu-Natal, for instance, my assessment seems to be that it's not working as intended. And when we look at South Africa's ambitious climate objectives, I mean, there is a framework to deal with, and it's been said that we require a comprehensive strategy that includes a more effective use of carbon pricing policy. Is it something, this very vague statement that the president spoke about, that we can bring all together all those nodules?
Possibly, but I think, again, that seems unlikely at this stage. So if we think about the framing of exactly what South Africa needs to do in terms of addressing climate change, obviously the first step that we need to think about is mitigation, and that's a global activity that's preventing the further climate change. So, and that really means drawing down on fossil fuel emissions, trying to transform our economy so that it's low carbon and resilient. The second part of it is adaptation. We have a certain amount of climate change that we're already experiencing. We can see more coming down the pipeline, and those impacts are going to be worse. So we need then to think about infrastructure and resilience. And as you say, the early warning systems are critical. But in the case of the KwaZulu-Natal floods that we've seen, early warnings would be useful in getting people out of the way, and they're critical in that regard. But actually, we also need to be thinking about, what do? We can expect those floods to come more frequently. So we need to be moving out of the sort of the areas directly next to flood zones, and building that infrastructure, looking at how do we channel flood waters to soak away areas. There's a whole huge amount of work that you can do when you're talking about resilience in urban areas and in rural areas, to think about droughts. So how do we maintain irrigation infrastructure, those sorts of things. That is going to be critical, and it's going to be an ongoing piece of work that's going to cost many, many billions. It's going to be a transformative for the economy. So it seems unlikely that is the scope of this fund at the moment. Certainly, we're not going to have that finance. But talking about this private sector partnership with government is taking those steps to do this collaborative process of transforming the economy. So that is very positive. My take is that at this first instance, what the fund is most likely to be targeted at is those vulnerable communities that have been impacted by the extreme events, and so really more of a disaster relief process. But there is a huge amount of work and ground that it could cover, and I guess the devil is in the detail. We have to see how much money we're hoping to leverage, and whether that's going to be drawing from international finance.
Well, this is what I was going to ask, because there's the Green Climate Fund where least developed countries are also counted, and I'd imagine that there is something that we can get from it. But if we're going to use it and use it efficiently, it also means that we need well-targeted support for affected industries and households. So if it's in the form of subsidies, that have to be efficient subsidies. So the greener financial sectorial measures, what would inform them then?
So there's a number of mechanisms that could work, but and I think that a lot of that is still to be explored. Certainly, when you're talking about the mitigation, your kind of carbon pricing is about mitigation. It's about driving the reduction in emissions. That's not the resilience and disaster risk reduction that the president mentioned. That really is more about we have the local municipalities with their disaster resilience plans. Now, how are those implemented and rolled out, and how are they funded? That's the sort of subsidy that we need to see going into the resilience planning. And similarly for private sector enterprise, where they're dependent on a lot of these resources, it's worth their while investing in some of the infrastructure, strengthening the infrastructure that supports their operations. So that kind of cooperative approach would certainly require subsidies. How they are structured, whether it's tax rebates, whether it is upfront co-investment for certain areas, that remains to be seen. But I do think things like early warning systems that fall sort of very firmly in the sphere of providing sort of disaster aversion for vulnerable communities. Those sorts of things would benefit hugely from private sector inputs. So we've seen similar things undertaken in Rwanda, where they use alerts through cell phone systems and through internet systems, and so huge dissemination, but can be very targeted because you can target the specific locales. That sort of thing could be very useful.
Okay. James, it's such a pity we've run out of time, but thank you very much for your time. James Reader, he is Climate Action Senior Manager at South Africa Worldwide Fund for Nature, speaking about President Cyril Ramaphosa's announcement yesterday that the government is looking at a climate change response fund. We're going to take a quick break. We're back with the latest edition in just a moment. Please stay with us.